I would like to thank all of you for joining in tonight. I think this one's an interesting one, but maybe that's my own personal bias here. Um, I am Jane Eliasof. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the director at the Montclair History Center, and I am presenting the program, and that's the entire introduction for the presenter that you're going to get. We've been running these since early April, and when it appeared that we were in this for the long haul. And we've had some really interesting programs, and we've got 3 more scheduled that'll take us through June 18. We've got one with Mike Farrelly, the town historian, talking about aviators, Montclair aviators. Then Dora McLeod is going to be speaking about New Jersey's music history. He is the owner of Legacy Coffee Shop down on Glenridge Avenue, but he's also a history professor at William Patterson and has a new book out. And then on the 18th, Erin Benz, who is on here, who's a member of our staff, she's doing a Rosedale Cemetery tour online. We normally do it in person, but because that's not feasible right now, we are doing it online instead. So interesting story. She'll also have some grave imagery and some other things happening. So all good. Join us if you can by June 18th. And then at that point, we'll decide whether we need to keep extending these or if we want to go down to maybe once or twice a month. But for now, we've got it weekly, usually at 12 and 7 p.m., but just check our website. A few logistical notes. Once I start the presentation, I'm going to mute everybody. You can unmute yourself, but if your dog is barking or the television is on in the background, please don't. You can ask a question using the little chat down at the bottom, the little bubble. And we have a couple people who will be monitoring that chat room so that if you forget your question at the end when I'm finally done speaking, you can very easily have that question asked for you. And finally, with the chat room, if you want to practice using it, there are 2 ways that you can do that. One is if there's more than one of you in a room watching on a screen, please note that in the chat room because that helps us get an accurate account. And the other thing is if you're from 20 miles away, believe it or not, the funders sometimes look for that. So if you can say if you're calling in from wherever, we've had people as far away as California calling in to these programs. So please let us know about that. As the regulars know, this is when I normally invite you to support the Montclair History Center. And I have been overwhelmed by the kind words and the support that you guys have given me. After every program, it seems, I have another membership or another donation, and that is so important to us. First of all, it tells us that you believe in our mission, and we're excited that we can bring it to you even this way when we can't do history in person. And it also helps us tremendously. We're a small not-for-profit. We don't get any town support. A lot of our major programs and funding or fundraisers are gone. And so we really are surviving on a shoestring and really appreciate any support that you can give us. You can do it 3 ways. One is on our website. We have a join or donate button. You can also buy a heritage brick for our new legacy patio if you want to do that. We do take Venmo. If you search for Montclair History Center, you'll find it. My name will pop up, but I swear it goes to the Montclair History Center. And finally, you can just write a check the old-fashioned way. So I go in probably once. Now we're inching into twice a week and just see what's going on there and make sure everything's okay. And I'll pick it up at that point. So unless anybody has anything else, Helen, I'm looking specifically at you. Do you have anything else you want to mention?
Yeah, I'm just going to reinforce, I'm the trustee on the board, and, we are so happy to be doing this programming, and, it actually takes us a lot of time to put it together. We're thrilled by the response, and I will just reiterate what Jane says, that, if you're enjoying these, and if you have the means to help us out a little bit, it would mean so much to us at this time. And if you can't, that's totally fine. We're just so delighted to see the response we're getting to these. So I just want to reinforce that what Jane was, the pitch that Jane was making, but and to reinforce, just so you know, we're so happy to see everybody here. The number of people able to attend by these Zoom meetings is just exponentially more than what we would typically be able to accommodate on site. So we're just delighted to be able to reaching out. This is fulfilling our mission to bring history to people in a more way.
So with that, I'm going to share, thank you, Helen. With that, I'm going to share my screen. So this is going to just take a minute while I do that. And okay. So as you know, tonight we're talking about the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. Back in March, when we began this lockdown, I began to wonder what was really going on here in Montclair during this period. What were people experiencing? Did they have the same feelings we did? Was it the same pattern, trajectory? What was going on? So I decided to do some research, and thanks to newspapers.com, which now has all of the archival issues of the Montclair Times, I got to work. You'll see that I do mention other towns. That's because at the time, the Montclair Times did cover other towns. So I will mention Glen Ridge, Caldwell, and Verona. I also mention a bit about national things because I think you really need a context for what was going on. Most of that information came from the CDC. It's not moving forward. Okay, so the 1918 flu epidemic is really a misnomer in many ways. First of all, it really lasted from 1918 to 1919. Second of all, it wasn't really a Spanish flu. It just got that nomenclature because there were a lot of people who developed the Spanish flu during 1918. And I think that I've heard people say, and I have not been able to document it, that a lot of the other countries in Europe that were experiencing it didn't want to let the world know about it. They were suppressing the news because of the war. And so that's how it became known as the Spanish flu. And finally, the pandemic was not even a term that anybody used back then. They referred to it either as an epidemic, as the plague, or as la grippe. So let's just take a look at the sort of the numbers behind it all. The facts are that that was an H1N1 virus, which was a bird flu. Overall, worldwide, there were 500 million cases. There were 20 to 50 million people who died worldwide, and in the United States, they totaled up to about 675,000 Americans. Compare that with the data that I pulled just yesterday, and we know it's already out of date, but just yesterday, there were 5.5 million cases worldwide, which is a far cry from the 500 million. The United States had 1.6 million. 98,000 Americans had died. We know that we've now crossed that $100,000 threshold. In New Jersey, we've had almost 160,000 cases. And in Montclair, as of 5/26, there were 416 cases and 48 people had passed away from it. I was unable to get the statistics from Montclair for the 1918 epidemic. I reached out to the Board of Health, and apparently those statistics are down at the state archives. And the state archives are rather closed at this point. From what I understand, there is a skeletal crew, but nobody responded. The other interesting thing is that there's a group called Reclaim Your Records, but they have a gap in their records from 1914 to 1920, so that doesn't help us very much. So let's set the stage. Just as a bit of background, as we think about the epidemic, we have to consider what was going on. On June 28th, 1914, the Great War, as it was known, began with the assassination of the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophia, which is pictured on the right-hand side of the screen. And then after declaring neutrality, the US entered the war on April 6, 1917, and that's my grandfather, Frank Mitchell, who served in the war. This March, as we, the first mention of the flu doesn't appear in the Montclair Times until May, but it's important to know that by March, it appears that the flu had already hit Europe heavily, and it had arrived on the shores of America. March, there were outbreaks of a flu-like illness at Camp Funston in Kansas. And according to the CDC, there was one Army private who reported to the camp sick bay one morning at breakfast. And by lunchtime, there were over 100 other soldiers in sick bay with him with the same symptoms. By the week's end, that number had enlarged to over 500 soldiers. A month later, on April 5th, it's the first mention of an influenza case in a weekly public health report, and that was in Haskell, Kansas, which was about 275 miles away from Fort Riley, and there were 18 severe cases and 3 deaths. During the first wave of the epidemic from March, April, and May, 14 of the largest training camps, military training camps in the United States, had reported outbreaks. And in May, that was when you had 8,000 Spanish people die from the flu, earning it that dubious distinction of becoming the name of the disease. It was also known as the purple death from the bluish tinge that was shown on the skin and the lungs of the victims. And it's in May when the Montclair Times first mentions the flu. The article is by a physician who was serving in the war, and he speaks to how medical professionals have proudly entered the service. And he says, quote, "In no walk of life have greater sacrifices been made or services more cheerfully rendered. And speaking as one unit of the 15,000 civilian doctors in the service, we are proud that Uncle Sam has given us that opportunity." The article goes on to mention that the doctors are treating a lot of chest diseases and influenza, but that's about all they say about it. It's in very generic terms. The photo on the right in front of Mountainside Hospital are the 14 civilian doctors from Montclair and the surrounding areas who did go to serve in the war.
Wow.
A week later, we see this ad in the Montclair Times. It's from the Guarantee Exterminating Company, who urge all residents to fumigate their homes because fumigation is the only positive way to destroy the germs, that you've got to fumigate every room and everything in it, that it's not just the serious contagious diseases that need fumigation, but also colds and flu. And their premise is that the spring is the breeding season for germs, and now is the time to deal with it. Remember, this kind of points to the fact that they understood germ theory, but they really were not, they hadn't figured everything out, nor did they have the tools to deal with them. We then have a lull. There's no mention in the Montclair Times of the first, of between what was the first wave and what would become the deadly second wave of the virus. But there are 2 mentions in the Montclair Times in August. The first one, on August 17th, the Montclair Times reports that a Montclair man, and his name is James Dugald White, was on the battlefield in France, and he was stricken with the flu. He and 2 other captains were, but never let the flu interfere with the line of duty. He was carried to the front on a stretcher along with the other 2 captains, and then they continued to direct the men during the critical hours of the fighting. Captain White was the son-in-law of James Owen, who lived on Christopher Street. And no, that's not him on the stretcher, but it gives you an idea of it, right? The next mention on August 24 is this great one. It talks about how, it's from the London Chronicle, and it talks about how if you just wear a nightcap, you'll be able to ward off the flu. But notice, it's still distant shores. It's the soldier in France. It's the people in London. It's still, in the minds of the people in Montclair, has not made it stateside. At the end of the month, though, things begin to really take a turn for the worse. On August 27th, 1918, there were 3 cases of influenza that were committed to the sick bay at Commonwealth Pier in Boston. And by the end of that month, there were over 60 sailors who had gotten sick and were in sick bay. And when I heard this and the ship, all I could think of was Captain Brett Crozier on the USS Theodore Roosevelt, who was one of the first ones to send up a warning sign saying, "We need help on this ship." And also all of those cruise ships that were put into port in different places around the world that really became breeding grounds for it. In a way, the ships were almost like the canaries in the coal mine. Okay, so the first in September, we're now at the real beginning of this second deadly wave. And the first cases are reported at Camp Devens, which is outside Boston. And it quickly spreads to the Naval Radio School in Harvard. And on September 5th, the Massachusetts Department warns that, quote, unless precautions are taken, the disease in all probability will spread to the civilian population of the city. Remember that date, September 5th, when the first warning comes out that it could move from the military to the civilian population. One of the reasons they were concerned and that it spread so quickly was that there were a lot of military training camps throughout the United States, and they were all overflowing. They were chock full, often to the point of overcrowding. And the military personnel were being moved among all of these different camps with no regard whatsoever to how it might have an impact on the spread of this disease. And President Woodrow Wilson was really no help on it. He was single-mindedly out to win the war, to the exclusion of worrying about the epidemic. In fact, he never made one public statement about influenza. He never inquired about whether or not it would have an impact on the civilian population. Instead, he and his administration were focused on boosting the national morale, and they wanted absolutely nothing to distract from that war effort. But alarm is beginning to spread. We heard that first one on September 15th. On September 5th rather, on September 13th, the US Surgeon General tells people how to recognize and treat the flu. But on September 13th, same day, the New York Health Commissioner says, don't worry about it. There's no need for our people to worry. Everything is going to be fine. And it's an interesting parallel to what went on today with the idea that perhaps it was spread by the Chinese. There was a Lieutenant Colonel Philip Duane, who was head of the Health and Sanitation section of the Emergency Fleet Corporation in Washington, D.C., who began to fuel the rumor that it was German warfare. He said it would be quite easy for one of these Germans to turn loose Spanish influenza germs in a theater or some other place where large numbers of people are assembled. The Germans have started epidemics in Europe. There's no reason they should be particularly gentle with America. By the end of September, there were more than 14,000 flu cases at Camp Devens. It equaled about 1/4 of the total population and resulted in 757 deaths. And here's what one unnamed physician wrote to a fellow physician at the end of September, September 29th, 1918, and it's pretty graphic. He said, the epidemic started about 4 weeks ago and has developed so rapidly that the camp is demoralized and all ordinary work is held up till it has passed. All assemblages of soldiers taboo. The men start with what appears to be an attack of la grippe or influenza, and when brought to the hospital, they were rapidly developing the most vicious type of pneumonia that has ever been seen. 2 hours after admission, they have mahogany spots over the cheekbones, and a few hours later, you can see the cyanosis or the bluing extending from their ears and spreading all over their face until it is hard to distinguish the colored men from the white. It is only a matter of a few hours and then until death comes, and it is simply a struggle for air until they suffocate. It is horrible. We have been averaging about 100 deaths per day, and they're still keeping up. There is no doubt in my mind that this is a new mixed infection here, but I don't know what. So the medical profession had the scientific knowledge of what was going on, but they just didn't have the tools to treat it in any way. So it's become a severe strain. It's coming closer to Montclair. Like today, it hit New York City first, then Newark. The Board of Health, by the end of the month, adds flu to the list of reportable diseases and requires all flu cases to be isolated at home. The real threat associated with the flu appears first in the Montclair Times on September 21st. The article compares it to la grippe, a disease that ran rampant in the 1890s and which stamped itself as an object of dread. The article goes on to briefly review the Spanish influenza, noting that it was seen in the battlefields in France and then the Spanish Peninsula. Notice there's no mention of Kansas. It talks about the outbreak at Camp Devens, noting that the medical chief of the Army and the Navy are on the job and that civilian medicine men will work to protect all of the civilians. The article ends on a positive note saying that we believe that the medical art of the country will fight effectively to reduce this new pest down to its possible minimum terror. And then, of course, the patriotic twist, just as we are battling in a different and bigger fashion to patter down the Teutonic pest to its lowest terror in future history. Page 1 of the September 28 Montclair Times article or issue urges Montclair women to head to the American Red Cross buildings to make gauze masks. Remember when we were all making masks? The Montclair chapter Red Cross had been asked to furnish 10,000 of them to go to Army hospitals. And I find it fascinating that they actually asked the women to go to the headquarters rather than have them make them at home, because chances are good during this period, women probably would have had sewing machines at home to do them. Further back on September 28, we see this article that describes how there were a committee of ladies who were very disappointed because they were scheduled to serve tea and cakes at Camp Merritt, which is an embarkation camp in Bergen County, sort of on the border of Cresskill and Dumont. They weren't allowed to go, however, because some of the men had already gotten the flu. So the ladies had baked their cakes, so they brought them to the YMCA secretaries to distribute. The article goes on to say, and I quote, "The men were mighty glad to get them and said that although the boys would not enjoy them as much as if they were passed by the ladies themselves, still they would make a bright spot in the day to a good many of the soldiers who otherwise would have had none." Notice the flu is still being presented, though, in military terms, in Montclair at least. However, the major cities, Boston, New York, Seattle, Philadelphia, are beginning to realize that they might have a problem on their hands. Nonetheless, on September 28th, there's a huge parade in Philadelphia to raise money for Liberty Bonds and also to ramp up some patriotism. It's held despite the knowledge that the epidemic was beginning to close in on them. And 3 days after the parade, 117 people died from the influenza. The daily death toll continued to rise so rapidly that at one point, the number of deaths in 1 week from influenza, the daily death toll from influenza equaled the death toll from all other diseases for 1 week. So they stepped up public education about how to prevent it. Don't cough without covering, don't sneeze without covering, and my favorite, don't spit in the street. That must have been a huge problem back then because they were actually arresting people who did. And then as one writer said, but the most terrifying aspect of the epidemic was the piling up of bodies. The city morgue had room for 36 bodies. 200 were stacked there. The stench was terrible. Doors and windows were thrown open and no more bodies could fit in. But when I saw this picture of the parade, especially after this weekend, all I could think of was the Lake of Ozarks party that was happening, where everybody was gathered together with no regard to the potential spread of the disease. We're now in October, and things are really going to get bad now. And it's compounded by the fact that the United States had a severe shortage of medical professionals. First, a lot of the doctors and nurses were already off serving either stateside or in Europe in the military camps. And second of all, they would not use the African-American medical professionals to treat white Americans. And so there was a shortage in that regard as well. One week later, the front page of the Montclair Times announces that there are over 400 cases in town and that there have been 4 deaths in the past week. Interesting to me, this is one of the very few accountings I saw as I went through the paper. Whereas today, you know, every day we know what the daily toll is, and now added on top of that the toll for tests, or the numbers of tested. But this was the only time I saw this in the Montclair Times. They mentioned that there were also 5 sailors from the Caldwell Rifle Range, which was actually not in Caldwell, but in Fairfield, by what was called Big Swamp near the Passaic River. It was named after James Caldwell, the Reverend James Caldwell, who was a hero during the Revolutionary War. But the men from the Navy Rifle Range were all brought to Mountainside Hospital when they got sick. So on Thursday, the Montclair Health Departments decide that we shouldn't have any social gatherings, but the schools don't need to be closed, not yet. There are 4 other mentions during that period, or during that paper. Page 7 tells us that a chaplain has been called to the front. Page 9 shares the news of another death from the rifle range. Page 10 talks about how the community can get involved, and they're still saying, let's write letters to the soldiers. And page 11 tells us the Park Street YMCA dorms are now closed to men in service because they're the ones that they believe are spreading the disease, in the first time since the Park Street YMCA had opened 4 years ago. The following week, April 12th, there are now 9 mentions of flu. The Unity Forum is canceled. The Knights of Columbus has canceled their programs. The Board of Health calls a halt to all church services until the spread is abated. The Belvedere Avenue Red Cross puts out an urgent plea for women to come back in and make some more face masks. But the most telling article is this one, which laid out the new guidelines. Basically, the state said, we can no longer leave this up to the local governments. We have to take matters into our own hands, and we are now going to start closing things down. And the rules sort of give you a sense of what life was like back in 1918. First, they're going to close all of the churches, the theaters, the moving picture houses, the dance halls, the pool rooms, the lodge rooms, the saloons, and the soda fountains. Everything there completely closed down. School closures are up to the local Board of Ed, and I'm still trying to figure out when the Board of Ed actually closed their schools, but we'll get to that a little bit later. They tell people to avoid unnecessary travel in public conveyances, specifically streetcars and steam railroads. Railroad traffic should be stopped. That all cases should be isolated in bed. All discharges from the throat and the nose shall be disinfected, pretty gross. And that there were no funerals of people who have died from influenza or pneumonia. Also, another telling rule was that there were no common towels or drinking cups. Remember back then, if you went into the restroom, a public restroom, you would not necessarily have one of those air dryers or paper towels. Instead, there would have been a common towel. And so what they're saying now is that must be stopped, as must common drinking cups at soda or water fountains. And finally, all utensils should be boiled or otherwise cleansed. Notice this is October 12th when this went down. We also, in this issue, heard about the death of 21-year-old Dorothy Dodd, who passed away on the front line, working as a frontline worker at the Essex County Homeopathic Hospital. She's buried at Mount Hebron Cemetery. And it's interesting that the disease hit people who were between 21 and 40 really hard. Usually you have a U-shaped curve that goes along with a disease where the youngest and the weakest might get it, and then the oldest might get it. But in this case, it was actually shaped more like a W, with that spike in the middle for the 21 to 40-year-olds. I don't know whether that's because of there's an epidemiological reason for it, or it was simply because it hit the military so hard, and that's the prime age for military service. Oops, sorry, passed by one. Among the other articles in there, there were a couple that made me smile. One talked about the use of cinnamon oil to reduce the fever associated with influenza. And the other acknowledged in a somewhat surprised editorial tone about how successful those female ambulance drivers have been, something that they simply could not have imagined 3 years ago. But on a serious note, you can really begin to see how overwhelmed Montclair and Mountainside have become. An article on page 12 talks about how Vincent Mulford, who was chairman of the Montclair chapter of the American Red Cross Society in town, became alarmed when an unknown physician or an unnamed physician in the 4th ward told them that he had 75 cases that he hadn't even reported yet because he was just too busy to do so. Mountainside Hospital had maxed out. They had no more space. So working with the Board of Education, they turned the Baldwin Street School into an emergency hospital. A plea went out to the community to furnish and equip it. And as one article said, quote, there was generous cooperation in town on the part of the car owners, hyphenated, and they sped from house to house with their machines, collecting beds and bed clothing and other supplies which had been proffered for the use of the emergency hospital. Drugs and food supplies were procured at local stores and hurried to the community house, which is adjacent to the Baldwin Street School. The emergency hospital actually accepted its very first patients the next day. And on that same week, the Times ran this ad on the right-hand side for additional help at the hospitals. And then lo and behold, the ban is lifted. You can see, hang on just one sec. Okay, the ban is lifted. On October 25th, it's announced in the Montclair Times that people can go back to their lives. Mayor Dodd made the announcement. He was not able to be there in person at the announcement because he was home suffering from what else but the flu. The lift goes into effect the next day. And so everything is open. There are no phased approaches at all. Churches can resume all their regular services. Schools can be reopened that Monday morning. All entertainment at the Montclair Theater is back on. Clubs and organizations can meet. The YMCA quickly jumps on the bandwagon, saying that they're now open because a healthy body is the best way to fight the flu. And so everything is back to normal. There's a report in that same paper of the workers at the emergency hospital, the Baldwin Street School, who praise the work that they have done there. They have seen 51 patients thus far, and they delivered one baby of an Italian woman, and you can see that little bassinet there right in that blue circle. We're now in November. The CDC estimates that in the previous month, there were 195,000 lives lost in just that 1 month alone. But in November, we begin to see some positive signs. The Montclair players are back in business. The Knights of Columbus is meeting. The Alliance Française is announcing that some of their programming will resume. So life is pretty much getting back to normal. Just think of the timing on that. That was October 12th when the ban went down and October 25th when that ban was lifted. So not a lot of time. And then on November 7th, there's a lot to celebrate. There is a false report that the Allies and the Germans have reached an armistice, and so there's wild celebrations. There was a parade in the streets. They gathered together at the amphitheater at Montclair High School to have some patriotic exercises. And the work at the Montclair Emergency Hospital announces that it was closed. And all in all, they had served a total of 54 patients. There was, quote unquote, a frenzy of patriotic exultation. But who could ask for more? They believe the war is over and the epidemic is under control. There are two items of interest in the November 9th issue. There's this one public service announcement for the New York Telephone Company that urges people not to use their phones except for emergency purposes. When I first read this, my first thought was, oh, because germs can gather on the telephones, on a common telephone. But no, it's because all the phone calls went through a central switchboard like this woman in her mask. If you were to make non-emergency phone calls, then those emergency phone calls would not be able to get through. There was also an announcement of an event at the First Congregational Church where they were giving a service of Thanksgiving for victory. But two of the things that really kind of made my ears jump a little bit, and one was that they filled every seat in the place, so you can see there was no 6-foot distancing there. And they decided that they were going to establish a memorial for the 31 men in the town who had given their lives in the war. And as we know, that did come to fruition, and it's now in Edgemont Park. But just 2 pages later, a week later, what we see is this little small notice from the Board of Health saying it behooves our citizens not to forget that there still exists a tendency for the spread of influenza due to the large gatherings caused by these celebrations. And the warning goes on not to say don't celebrate, but just if you're going to celebrate, maintain your distance because, and this is probably my favorite quote in this article, the firing range of a careless cougher or sneezer is at least 3 feet. The same issue also notes the passing of another young man from the Montclair Academy who had passed away from influenza as well. Interesting because on November 23, we see this article that talks about how with all of the deaths from the influenza epidemic, and they believed at the time it was 78,000, that it had now surpassed the number of deaths that of the men who had served in the Great War. And I found this really interesting and sort of one of those timing things because when I was researching this was the same day that this headline came out that said that coronavirus has now killed more Americans than the Vietnam War. And as we know now, that's made even more sort of upsetting because in the New York Times today, I saw that it's killed more Americans than every war since the Korean War. But the good news is the ladies have made it to Camp Merritt after all. They served 1,000 men ice cream cones and wafers, and they had received an urgent call from the hut secretary saying that the men were bored and please come and help. So they also entertained them with dances and songs and one-act plays. And they are in such hot demand that they are requested to visit Camp Raritan as well. We're now in December, and this is one of my favorite articles that I had seen in December. Oh, I'm sorry, it's still the end of November. This is an ad that is for Maltolium, which is, according to the U.S. Official Patent Office, is good for bronchitis, pulmonary diseases, nervous exhaustion, and a disability following recovering from a wasting fever. It's also good for things like bad colds and influenza. They're jumping on the bandwagon. And if you don't use them for them, it's a good appetizer too. But there were also some sad news. Several articles had some obituaries in them. There was work praising the Montclair chapter of the American Red Cross. And there's a discussion about how coal was now in short supply because of the epidemic and also because of the Armistice Day celebrations. So they had coal and we had toilet paper. And now we are in December. So the rest of the world is still giddy with the end of the war and the supposed end to the flu. But public health officials are beginning to get a little bit more cautious. They continue educational programs warning people about the dangers of coughing and sneezing and careless disposal of nasal discharges. The American Public Health Association tries to encourage people to stagger their opening and closing hours and to walk to work whenever possible. And just like today, things are getting worse for the indigenous population. There is one report of how in 5 days, 72 out of 80 native inhabitants of Alaska died in a small town. The December 7 issue is pretty uneventful, with a couple of mentions of servicemen who had the flu and recovered. Again, the scarcity of coal is a big issue, and a fundraiser at the Montclair Theater that didn't bring in much money or as much as anticipated because it was launched during the flu epidemic. But things become a little more ominous in the following week The December 14 issue reports that cases are increasing in Montclair and that Verona and Glen Ridge have chosen to close their schools because of the prevalence in those communities. The Board of Education has decided that they're going to make up for the 3 missing days in October by holding classes on New Year's Day and the balance of the week. And I find this is the only indication that I have of how long schools may have been closed during that October shutdown. It sounds like it was only those 3 days, unless they decided they were just going to let some of them pass. And then this down at the bottom, you'll see that it says that 12 teachers were absent in Montclair this week. We don't know whether that was because of the flu or something else. But nonetheless, the basketball game must go on. The YMCA Dodgers are playing the USN Rifle Range team from Caldwell. And anybody can go, it's free admission. And I just found that really ironic because that was the USN Rifle Range was the camp that got really hit hard, was the hot spot just 6 weeks before. We also see this report in December about the Glen Ridge Country Club, which had been used as a convalescent home for the men at that Caldwell Rifle Range. Apparently, when they first got sick, the Army wanted them just to come right back to camp, then realized that that may not be the best idea. So they moved them into this convalescent home at the Glen Ridge Country Club, which freed up additional space at Mountainside Hospital for other people. And we also, unfortunately, begin to see a lot more obituaries either related to the influenza, pneumonia, or in some cases, the pneumonia that was caused by the influenza. The public health articles continue to come out about how to care for people at home. And there was an interesting little write-up about a woman from the Montclair Women's Club who noted in her lecture that influenza was worse if you sleep with your windows closed. And then finally, on December 28th, we see there's an article titled How Influenza Arrived in America. And it was written by a group of physicians who were meeting at the Hotel Astor in New York City. And they said that it came through the port of Boston. Notice there's still no connection to this into Kansas. That there were no reported cases coming through New York City. They reported that frequent hand washing was critical and that you should not touch your face with your soiled hands, that drinking cups and utensils should be chemically cleaned, that healthy carriers can transmit the disease. And today there was just an article in the New York Times that talked about how they think that that's a more prevalent problem today than they thought previously. And then finally, there's a question as to whether or not masks can actually help, which is a question I heard on the news just 1 week ago. So I won't belabor 1919 because really there's not a lot of mention it in the papers. Throughout the first months of the year, we see more obituaries, more words of advice: cover up when you cough or sneeze, don't spit. There are more ads for services and products to help prevent or cure influenza. And there's more general references to the flu and its toll on human life. I did find one accounting in March that even in February, there were 44 cases reported. And we don't know whether the deaths associated during that month were due to flu or something else. But it looks like when you begin to look at the mortality data, that indeed this continued through the spring of 1919. So I wasn't able to find stats specifically for Montclair, as I mentioned earlier. So the best I can do is show you New Jersey. I combined both the deaths associated with influenza and those associated with pneumonia because I'm not sure whether they were reported correctly. But you can still see the waves. In the first wave, right around here, you see that they're all being reported as pneumonia, and there are some very tiny little ones down here that show influenza. But look at that spike in October. And then it does go down remarkably in November and December. In January and February, it spikes back up again and then begins to go down and then pretty much peters out. So you can see the three distinct waves that went along with this virus. And I find the parallels really interesting when, for example, when Mountainside Hospital realized that they were maxed out and they needed to open up that additional hospital at the Baldwin Street Community School. I felt like that was the point in this epidemic that we were feeling back in March and early April, when the disease just kept coming and coming, and we kept waiting for that plateau and it wasn't happening. And then the field hospitals were being set up at Javis, at Central Park, and the Meadowlands, and the U.S. Comfort was sailing in to try and help. So it just, to me, that's where that was, and it was right around here when that was happening. So this whole thing raises some questions in my mind, and would that spike have been lower in October had indeed somebody listened to that September 5 warning about the possible dangers of it to the civilian population? If they'd stayed closed for longer than just 2 weeks or less than 2 weeks, would that have mitigated some of the deaths the following spring? We don't know. But as I began to try and figure out how I was going to close this presentation, I wrestled with it for several days and realized that I wasn't coming up with an answer because we haven't finished this yet. We really don't know where we're going to be in a month, 2 months, 3 months. And so I really can't come up with any pat statements about how we did this and so it was better, or we did this and so it was worse. So instead I decided I was just going to take the easy way out and thank the workers, both then and now, who have so tirelessly fought to keep this epidemic under control and us healthy. So with that, I'm going to stop my screen share and come back to you all. And if you have questions, you're welcome to ask them. If nobody wants to volunteer, if there are any questions in the chat room that somebody would like to read, that would be great. And I open it up to all of you. Just remember, you're muted. If you have something you'd like to say, just unmute yourself. The little microphone in the bottom left-hand corner should not have an X through it if you wanted to speak.
I think it was unusual that after 2 weeks, they opened everything up again and they didn't have a big, spike again.
I don't know. I don't know. I'm not an epidemiologist. I can't speak to that. I don't know.
It seems strange. You would think they would have. I mean, 2 weeks.
It's nothing.
Not much, yeah.
Jane, I missed the first part. Did they ask the public to wear masks?
They did ask the public to wear masks. There were actually some pictures that I saw with people with masks on them, but it was not as big, and it was the bigger health thrust was to cover up, use a handkerchief, not necessarily wear a mask. I don't think there was the same insistence on wearing the mask that there is today.
Cover up your nose and mouth?
Because those nasal discharges, right, they can be a real problem for you. They have a firing range of 3 feet. So
if you're coughing or sneezing.
Right.
And the social distancing, was that something they
didn't see anything about social distancing? I saw if you were sick, you isolated. And they were pretty strict on the isolation of a sick person, but not necessarily on healthy people. The first mention I saw of healthy asymptomatic people being potential carriers was in that December 28th issue.
People didn't stay home even though things were closed.
No. They may have initially. They may have during that 2-week period. But fortunately or unfortunately, the end of the war brought everybody out. I mean, there was just too much celebrating and dancing in the streets to keep everybody tight and close to home.
Did you say, is there sorry.
Somebody asked in the chat where the Baldwin Street School was, and I just answered in the chat, but just in case anybody else was wondering, it was on the corner of Baldwin and Glenridge Avenue across from Nicolo's. It's condominiums now. It was known as Washington School for a while.
Thanks, Helen.
So is there a listing or a directory somewhere of people from Montclair who did die during the 1984?
I have not been able to find it.
Too bad.
But today,
Never solved the mystery of Fred.
We've heard anecdotes. First of all, we have heard today at the noon one, there was a family whose grandmother had passed away, and they were sharing her story. The other thing is there are obituaries in the Montclair Times, but this disease, just like COVID, hit the lower income communities and people of color in a harder way, and those people were not reported in the Montclair Times. So that's an incomplete count of what
Right.
the number.
Jane, this is Sharon.
Hi, Sharon.
As I had mentioned to you some time ago when we were doing my family's history, my grandmother's 3 brothers died
Remember that.
within weeks of each other. They were both in their, all 3 of them were in their late teens. And the 3 of them died, as well as my grandmother's aunt. They all died during this period of time as well, in Montclair.
Right. They were football players, right? If I remember correctly?
No, they were baseball players.
Baseball players.
They were
Okay.
baseball players. They played on the, I forget the name, but it was Glenfield School's baseball team.
Okay.
And so that was the team, the 3 of them played with other members as well.
Okay. Does anybody else know if they have family members who passed away from it in Montclair or elsewhere?
No, I just have a young boy named Fred who shows up in the 1920 census as a son of my grandfather, great-grandfather, but no birth record. I wondered if maybe his parents died in the pandemic and that's how we ended up living with my grandmother and her family. But
Occasionally,
there's
you
no
can
way to check it out.
there's if you were to look on like some of the genealogy websites, you can sometimes find death certificates, but you can't really go in and say, I'm looking for everybody in Montclair who died of this from that. But if you have the name of somebody, you can look on those websites and possibly see.
Yeah, his name is listed as the same last name as my grandmother, so I don't know potentially what his name might have been. I know his first name.
Mhm.
Not a family name, so it seems like he came from somewhere else. He ended up living with them. And then he's gone again at the next census because now he's older and
Right,
who
gone.
knows. Yeah, frustrating. The mystery continues.
We all have them in our family tree, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Say,
Yeah, that's
Jane,
like, who's Fred?
this is Carol.
Hi, Carol.
Hi, where were these Red Cross ladies taking their cakes and goodies to these 2 camps? Is it Raritan and Merritt? How
Camp
close?
Merritt.
How close were they to the city or to
Camp
Montclair?
Merritt is in Bergen County. It's in Dumont. It's sort of on the border of Dumont and Cresskill. There's actually a circle, a roundabout there in the middle, and they have a monument there to the people who died from the flu. Cresskill, Dumont, probably 22 miles away from New York City.
Okay.
It's right
Thank
in
you.
Bergen County, not far from Hackensack and Paramus.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else?
Jane, just in the comments, someone's saying that they, in some of my readings, I've seen the Spanish influenza depicted as a frightening Spanish lady versus today's medical depiction of the spiked coronavirus. Did you see that graphic?
I did not, but I really wish I had.
Yeah. And do we know if the Montclair Community Hospital was open at that time?
I don't know the answer to that. It was not mentioned in it was not mentioned in any of the reports that I read. And I also sort of wondered whether they set up the Baldwin Street School emergency hospital for 4th Ward patients. I saw something that mentioned that there were a lot of 4th Ward patients in there. I don't know whether it was a segregation issue or what the story is behind it, but
there's another question about the Baldwin Street Community Home. Was it there in the 30s? So the
Montclair Historical Society.
there was a community center Street Community Center, where they did do programs for, recent immigrants. Very much that was the Pine Street area where a lot of immigrants from Italy were coming, people who had lived in the country and now they were living in really a city. So there was a community center there that serviced the Italians and also then the African Americans who were making that neighborhood their home. And so it's still there. I mean, it's where they have, it's the Minnie Lucy building. First it was in the school and then it moved to the Minnie Lucy building, which is still there and used by the, is it the Head Start program?
Mhm.
Yes, it's the Montclair Child Development Center.
Jane,
Yes.
this is Pam in Harrisburg. One quick question. I know you said it. I just want to make sure I understand. Did you say that newspapers.com now has all of the Montclair Times online?
Yes, it does.
Good. That's good to know. Thank you.
Yes, it does. And if you want to go further back, before the Montclair Times, if you go, you have to get another subscription though, but it's Genealogy Bank. And there's
Okay.
something called the Sentinel of Freedom. And that's early 1800s, but it covers Montclair, Montclair as well. Yeah, Genealogy
that's
Bank.
very good.
The newspaper is called Sentinel of Freedom.
Thank
But
you.
again,
Write
neither
that
of
down.
those
Thank
two
you.
are covered on Ancestry.com.
Yeah, great. Thanks.
Well, I thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Next week, as I said again, it's Montclair Aviators Take to the Sky if you're interested. And I hope to see you again. Thank you to all the regulars who've been coming back. It's nice to see your faces all the time. And thank you to everybody new who joined us tonight.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Take care.
Thank you. Very good.
Good
Really
job.
enjoyed it.